Hello everyone and welcome to the video. This is the long-awaited part 2 of my Conspicuity stripe video. As many of you know if you've seen the last video on the topic, I made the decision to separate the review of the new decals from the information about Conspicuity stripes in general. This video will be the review and how-to guide for applying the new Fusion Scale Graphics FY1N, FY2N, and LY1N Conspicuity stripe decal sets. Around late January and early February, Fusion Scale Graphics had released a run of reflective stripes in N-scale with a twist. Unlike most other Conspicuity stripe decals, these actually reflect light in much the same way that the prototypical tape does, so if you want to add an extra layer of realism to your model railroad, these stripes are a good way to do it. Just turning the light in my room off, I can show you the glow of the tape using a small desk lamp as a light source. It can be a little difficult to make some of these stripes out, I know, but you can see the bright glow where I've installed stripes on just a few of my locomotives and rolling stock. One thing to note is that these are not water slide decals. They instead have an adhesive back to them. On one hand, that makes these decals even easier to apply than the more typical water slides. But on the other hand, these decals are, out of necessity, thicker than water slides, as a water slide decal would be too thin for a reflective layer to properly work. Despite the thicker profile, which is really not too noticeable unless you're that one guy in the club that nitpicks every little detail and won't hesitate to let you know if something looks wrong, these decals are a must-have for anyone who wants their rolling stock to shine a little brighter in the dark. For this next part, I'm going to apply these decals on a few of my locomotives and freight cars. To do this, you won't need much as far as tools. All you really need apart from the decal set itself is a magnifying glass if you need one, and a couple of small blades. I use both the angled and straight blade for this project. The angled blade is used for prying the decal off the sheet and positioning it on the model, and I use the straight blade to cut the decal if I need to, as every once in a while I'll run into something like a molded ladder rung or some sort of surface irregularity on the model that I need to cut the stripe for. The first locomotive I'll be applying these decals to is my Kato BNSF AC4400 CW. Now, when I apply decals like these stripes, I tend to want to be as true to life as my skill will allow, so in conjunction with my basic tools, I also use a site called railroadpicturearchives.net to find photo references of the prototype model that I'm modifying. For locomotives, this is very easy, as pretty much every locomotive has been photographed at least once throughout the years. In most cases, they've actually been photographed at least 10 times. This isn't as true for freight cars, but I'll get into that later. Anyway, I'll start by opening up my browser and hopping onto railroadpicturearchives.net. From the home page, I'll go to where it says View Photos and click on By Railroad, which will narrow my search. Here, this site groups pretty much everything into smaller and smaller subgroups, so if you know generally what equipment you're looking for, you'll have an easier time looking for the exact photos you want. In this instance, since we're already under major carriers, I'll click on BNSF, and in here I'll simply go to the number under Locomotive Roster. Now, this is a list of every locomotive that the BNSF Railroad has or ever had in their roster in ascending numerical order. We are looking for AC4400s, so to help us thin this list down further, we'll go over to where it says Roster Options and click on Group by Model. That will neatly sort every entry by what model of locomotive it is. From there, I'll scroll down to where it says AC44CW and click View, and that'll bring up our final list of 123 locomotives, which is definitely better than sifting through photos of over 10,000 locomotives. Now the road number we are looking for is number 5624. All we have to do is scroll down to that number and click on it, and we'll see all the pictures taken throughout the years of this locomotive. Since I am modeling modern day, I tend to look for pictures that are as recent as possible, but for the sake of safety stripes, any photo post-2005 will suffice. After scrolling through the list, I found photos of both sides of the locomotive that I like. One from 2022 and another from 2023. And now that all the prep work is done, I can finally get started applying these decals. This locomotive has 10 stripes on each side, which is generally standard for BNSF locomotives. For the conductor's side, we'll start with this stripe up front. Like I said before, these decals are adhesive rather than water slide, so applying them is very easy. All you need to do is position the decal where you want it, and firmly press on it once it's where you like it. That's pretty much it, honestly. This isn't a very in-depth tutorial since applying these stripes is literally that easy. One thing that you likely noticed is that there are different versions of these decal sets. In the case of this locomotive, the FY1N and FY2N are both suitable for this project, as both of these sets have an excess of small stripes. Where these sets differ is in the stripes applied to the ends of the car, as they are, depending on the set, wider or longer than the middle stripes. This obviously isn't important right now, but it will become more important once I get started with the freight cars. Back to this locomotive, you may also notice the small white stripes already dotting this locomotive body. In the era I am modeling, most of these stripes have faded away and very few are still visible. For this model, that can be remedied with any method you prefer, whether you want to rust up the area where the stripes are, paint over it with the BNSF green paint, or gum it up with paint and chalks that emulate mud, dirt, and grime. Now that I've given you a few tips for these decals, let's see how the locomotive turns out once it's finished. Here is the conductor side of the locomotive now that all the stripes have been applied. I haven't done anything with the pre-existing white stripes yet, but that is mostly because I want to paint over them with BNSF green, and I don't have that color on hand at the moment. Another thing to point out is that the last stripe here needed to be cut down because the handrail was going to interfere with the decal's smooth application. I wasn't able to record that, but I was able to do it with my straight blade, and I put both ends on either side of the body where the rail was going to interfere. Here is the engineer side of the locomotive after installing the new stripes. There isn't really much I can say that hasn't already been said. These decals, albeit small, are a very simple and error-friendly method for detailing your railroad equipment. Next up, we'll move on to some freight cars. To begin with something simple, here is a CEFX gondola from Athearn. Before we begin the application for this car, we need to find photos of this freight car so we know how they're installed on the prototype. If you are not looking to be exactly prototypical, here is the general rule for the stripes on gondolas. You can take a moment to pause the video here and see what the orientation for the stripes on this car ought to look like. For those of you as propeller head as me, let me start off by saying I share your pain. Anyway, we're going to go back to the View Pictures by Railroad tab on Railroad Picture Archives. From here, we're going to select the Leasing Companies section and find the one labeled CEFX and click on the number under Rolling Stock Roster. Now, CIT Group is a big leasing company with a lot of cars of varying types in their roster. So to make our work easier, we will click on the link on the top right that says CEFX grouped by type. Now, instead of over 12,000 freight cars, we only need to look through a little over 2,000. Still daunting, but manageable. In this case, we're lucky that CI2 Group began the gondola number series in the 30,000s, as we are looking for number 30256. Scrolling to the bottom of the page, we can see it here. After clicking on that, we can find our pictures. Luckily, this car is photographed 6 times throughout the years, so we have a shot at finding what we're looking for. This isn't always a guarantee though, but I'll get into that later. Here, after scrolling to the bottom of the page, I managed to find one picture of each side of the car. Getting both sides for freight cars isn't too necessary, but it doesn't hurt since stripes aren't always replaced in the same way all the time. One little note that I picked up on while working on this project is how the car isn't exactly a one-to-one recreation of the prototype. Now, I am 100% nitpicking here, I know. It's a curse of being a strict self-grading rivet counter, but anyone with a similarly acute eye for detail will notice that some of the decals don't entirely match up with the prototype. This isn't a huge deal, especially for this project, but for the sake of these stripes, I'll be applying them based on the prototype positions on the car, rather than being relative to the placement of the other decals. I can remove and replace the other decals later on, as Fusion Scale Graphics makes decals for all sorts of stuff, including lubrication data. With that being said, let's check back once I have both sides completed. Like I'd said before, this one's a pretty easy one, not just because of the simple design of the car, but also because the prototype photos I went with, my reference points, show that the car has evaded graffiti artists and taggers over the years. Graffiti doesn't make a project like this much more difficult, but sometimes you'll see a rail car that has been freshly tagged, but the stripes had not yet been replaced. It's just something else for a hyper-realistic modeler to consider. Next up is another car from Athearn. This is an Automax auto rack belonging to a short line railroad called Arkansas and Oklahoma. You may have seen a lot of their rolling stock over the years, as they have everything from grain hoppers to well cars and everything in between. Like with the gondola before it, I'm going to find some pictures to reference for Conspicuity stripe positioning, but before I do, here are a couple of templates for how they are typically configured on both articulated and single auto racks. These cars are pretty easy since they too follow similar guidance to boxcars and gondolas. To find the photos I need for this car, first I'll click on Short Lines and look for A-OK. Once I've found that, I'll click on View Photos under Rolling Stock, which shows us a list of over 6,400 entries. From there, I'll sort the results by type and click on Auto Rack. We are looking for number 501, 509, which, lucky for us, is right here on the first page. After clicking on this, we see that there are two pictures. Both of these pictures actually show both ends of the same car, or in this case, since the railcar is articulated, or shares a truck in the middle of both halves, car A and car B. Unfortunately, we can only see one side of the car bodies here, but that isn't really an issue, as I can just assume that the stripes on that end are identical to those on this end. Remember before when I mentioned that graffiti is another aspect to consider when thinking about Conspicuity stripe placement? This here is kind of what I was alluding to. You can see here that the Conspicuity stripes have been replaced sometime since the graffiti was painted onto this car. You can absolutely add Conspicuity stripes without adding the graffiti, there's nothing wrong with that. But personally, I will skip the stripes that have been replaced and wait until after I've made a decal set to apply to this auto rack for the graffiti before I place those stripes in. Back when I did the locomotive, I mentioned that there are multiple types of sets for these stripes. For the sake of this car, we will be using the FY1N set, as this set has double length strips for the car ends. The set we used for the gondola was the FY2N, as it had the double width strips. The surface of this model is pretty smooth, so applying the stripes onto the body of this car is going to be pretty hassle-free. For this side of the car, I'm only going to do the first and last two stripes, as I want to add graffiti to this car later on, and then I'll add the stripes on top of that. Another helpful tip for some cars is that some of them will already have white or yellow stripes applied to them from the factory, which makes applying these decals a real no-brainer. In this case, you can faintly see some white strips on the body of the car. Applying the stripes on top of those will put the stripes in just about the exact right position they need to be. Moving on to the other half of the car, I'll also skip the middle of it so I can add the graffiti later on. And for the last stripe, the brake lever will actually interfere with the placement of the stripe, so I will cut the long stripe down a bit and put the small piece on the right side of the brake lever and the big piece on the left side. Now, since I don't have a photo of the other side of this car, I'm going to make the executive decision to do all the stripes on this side, assuming that there's only small amounts of graffiti that I can work around, or even a large amount of graffiti where the artist covered the tape, which I've actually seen before numerous times. To wrap up this video, I have one more car to apply these decals to, so let's move on to a tank car. The last car we'll be working on in this video is an Athearn 33,000 gallon isoprene tank car. I saved this one for last because as of now, there is still no reference photo in the archives for this particular car. This is a small hiccup though, as I can still reference other tank cars and this template here for how the stripes are meant to look. If you remember from my last video on Conspicuity stripes, the regulation says that the stripes are meant to be oriented vertically on the car, with either the middle or the top of the tape in line with the center line of the car. In addition, no stripes can be placed underneath the manway of the car to prevent spillage from damaging the tape. To further help me out with this car, I've pulled out one of my identical tank cars with a different road number, which I have applied these stripes to some time ago. This will help me to determine exactly how many stripes I want to apply to the car. If you don't have another car you can use for this project as a reference, you can look up photos of identical prototypes on the archives, just know that you won't find this exact number as of now. For this car, I will be lining up the top of each stripe with the center line, which is right around the top of the UTLX reporting marks. A tank car of this size will have 6 or 7 stripes, and as long as they are vertical and clear of the manway, they will look right per the guidance of the regulation. To keep the tape clear of the manway, it is permissible to apply it slightly off-center if it's needed. Once all the stripes are applied, this is what the final product is going to end up looking like. As you can see, applying these stripes is a very easy, fun, and hassle-free project for you to do if you have a lot of time on your hands and you don't want to get into a very involved project. Another fun and creative aspect is that although there are regulations that go over how the stripes should look, you'll always be able to find examples of unique configurations for the stripes. That about wraps up this very long-awaited review and guide for the Fusion Scale Graphics reflective decals. If you want these decals yourself, unfortunately, the LY1N and the LW1N are the only available sets as of recording this video. I want to apologize for the long delay in creating this video. I wanted this video to be a back-to-back release with my first video essay on these stripes, but I got bogged down with work stuff, and I recently started doing some other volunteer work, so my schedule has been so packed that the only videos I have been able to reliably produce are my high iron videos. In fact, by the time you see this video, all the recording and editing for it will have been done about a month before. As of you seeing this video now, I am currently away on a work trip and coming back a few weeks from now. But so that my channel wouldn't go on a hiatus, I wanted to schedule weekly releases to come out the entire time I've been gone, which is why you've still been seeing weekly uploads for the past month despite my absence. Once things finally start tapering off, which should hopefully be soon, I will have enough room in my schedule to make a greater variety of videos for you to watch. I plan on making a video review for the new Athearn 33,000 gallon LPG tank cars and the Intermountain bi-level auto racks that came out a couple months back. I'll also be taking some time off back in Southern California, and with that, I'll have more high iron videos coming from California. While I'm out there, I'll be visiting a few familiar spots around Bakersfield, Hanford, and the Tashby Pass, but I also want to try going out to Mojave, Barstow, the Cajon Pass, and urban areas like when I went to Long Beach and Fullerton earlier this year, as well as a few others. With all that being said, thank you so much for watching, thank you so much for waiting for this video, and I hope to see you for future videos. Take care, everyone!